皆さん、また来てくださってありがとうございます。こちらはマンハッタンニューヨーク月曜日の午後です。ということで今日の動画はライジングっていう番組からの抜粋でロバート・ケネディ・ジュニアさんの独占インタビューが出てたので載っけてみます。この人とにかくすごいんですよ。本当にすごいんです。全然民主党っぽくないので皆さんぜひぜひ見てください。ちょっとあまりにも突っ込みすぎことをおっしゃってるので私消されるんじゃないかと思ってこわごわ上げています、消される前に見てください。どうぞ。
For a special Rising exclusive interview with 2024 Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
He joins us now. Welcome to Rising.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we so appreciate it. So many questions we want to get to, so let's kick it right off with COVID. So friends of our show, Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, reported the other day that the earliest COVID patients actually did come from the Wuhan lab. They were scientists there. If this is confirmed, it would all but guarantee the lab leak theory, which I believe you've said in the past. You also think COVID originated from a Chinese lab. If that is the case, I want to know, will you prosecute Fauci and hold others criminally responsible in the U.S. health apparatus who advocated and funded gain-of-function research?
I think I'm going to have to look at that, but I think they should be prosecuted. I think it was reckless endangerment. They knew, all of these labs, including the Wuhan lab, had a history of leaks. There were numerous memos from the State Department and others saying that the lab was dangerous. It wasn't even a BSL-4 lab that they were doing this research in. It was a BSL-2, BSL-3 labs that have very, very low thresholds and and this kind of research is malpractice. To do it in the labs, that the actual scientist who got ill, they're now saying is patient one, is Ben Hu, who was the underling for the bat lady for Xi Zhengli, and his funding and her funding came directly from NIH, and NIH taught them the technology for developing, not only for making the technology that was used to make these viruses more infectious, more virulent, more deadly, but also this technology called the seamless ligation technique, which is just a bioweapons technique for concealing human tampering on engineered viruses. And it was utterly irresponsible to be teaching anybody that. They should not have developed that technique in the first place. It's the inverse of everything that you would do if you actually were interested in public health. It's just, it's bioweapons technology.
So sticking with COVID just for one more minute here, President Biden obviously mandated vaccines for millions of workers before the Supreme Court struck that down. President Trump presided over Operation Warp Speed to have government funding to get the vaccines off the ground. How would your administration have handled vaccines differently in terms of mandates and government funding for them? What did those two individuals do that you would have done differently?
They did almost everything wrong. First of all, they shouldn't have locked down society. We now know, and we knew back then, that it would be cataclysmic, that it would cause far more injury and economic costs, long-term economic costs. $16 trillion it's going to cost our country over the long run. It shifted $4 trillion in wealth from the middle class in our country to this new, oligarchy of billionaires. We created a billionaire a day during the pandemic. All of the pandemic response preparedness protocols that have been developed for decades, in fact, almost for a century, all said unanimously, you do not lock down societies. You keep them open. You quarantine the sick, you protect the vulnerable, you keep society open, and then you focus on therapeutic drugs with proven safety histories. And that's what we should have done. It would have been much more effective to give people even vitamin D and to lock them down and wait for a vaccine that we now know. The Cleveland Clinic study just came out, a new version of the study yesterday that shows that the more vaccines that you got, the more likely you are to get COVID. This is what the science is saying. That's 56,000 employees of Cleveland Clinic, a major, large study is showing the vaccine not only doesn't work, but it works opposite of what we were told that it was going to work. We should have focused on the therapeutic remedies that actually work. It's things like Zithromax, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin. The countries that use those had much better records. Our protocol gave us the worst body count from COVID on earth. So doing everything that our government told us to do, we racked up 16% of the COVID deaths globally. We only have 4.2% of the population. The countries that used ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, countries like Nigeria didn't even have a pandemic. We were told they were going to suffer terribly because of their poverty. Instead, they had a death rate 1/200th of the death rate we had in this country. And you can look across the globe. The countries that adopted our protocols did the worst in terms of COVID deaths, COVID mortalities. The countries that did the opposite, that employed ivermectin, employed hydroxychloroquine. Nigeria had a 1.3% vaccination rate, and it had 14 deaths per million population. We had 3,000 deaths per million population. Of course, it was a war on the poor. The poor suffered and shouldered the burden of these protocols more than any other parts of our population.
Well, that's a good segue to our next question. Go ahead, Brianna.
To your point, actually, about the aggregation of wealth that happened during the pandemic and how it disproportionately, the economic burden was on the poor. And the billionaires, millionaires and billionaires' wealth increased by 64% in the context of the pandemic. And so I want to put to you, a majority of Americans support a wealth tax for that reasons and others. You've described how much better the economic system was, the culture of your youth was in the period between the war and the 1980s. Would you support the kind of taxation that also existed back then when there were more taxes levied on the very wealthy?
My plan, Brianna, is not to change the overall tax burden. I will shift the burden around. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do that. I know that I will restore the child tax credits, and so the burden will shift, but I'm not going to raise the overall burden on taxes for Americans.
So Biden committed to not raising taxes on people who made less than $400,000 a year. Are you saying that you wouldn't raise taxes on anyone, including those like the billionaire tax, which is extremely popular, and others who make well over $400,000 a year?
I'm not saying that I won't shift the tax burden. I'm saying that I'm not going to tax people more I'm not going to raise taxes on people who make less than $400,000 a year. As I said, I may shift the overall tax burden. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do that yet. I need to study that issue, and I need to sit down with experts and figure out the best way for keeping our economy moving and actually rebooting our economy. But also, ultimately, I think what you talked about at the beginning, which was to figure out ways to restore the middle class in this country and reduce these extreme disparities between the very wealthy, these huge aggregations of wealth, and the widespread poverty that we're seeing below. We need to do that. It's not healthy for our society. It is an unstable configuration that cannot support democracy for any kind of sustained periods.
One of the reasons I think you're completely right that critics of extreme wealth think that there are anti-democratic implications are because the very, very wealthy have tried to do things like buy their way into elections the way that Bloomberg did in the last cycle. There's obviously an incredibly corruptive influence from lobbying, money, and politics, things that you've criticized a great deal in the context of the CDC and the pharmaceutical industry. And so I'm curious how you plan to run your own campaign. Do you have any plans to take a no corporate money pledge the way that Bernie Sanders did in 2020 and still managed to out-fundraise the rest of the field? And if not, how do you plan to manage some of the conflicts of interest that emerge when people, let's say some of the Silicon Valley billionaires who have shown interest in your campaign, start to make demands potentially that are out of step with what the American public would like?
I am going to, there are limits on what I can accept. The campaign can only accept contributions of $3,300 per person. That's the maximum campaign contribution. Most of our contributions so far have been much smaller than that. And we are not legally allowed to accept campaign contributions that are larger than that.
Of course, there are these other ways that people contribute, right? They host fundraisers for folks. They're independent expenditures. They're not supposed to be directed by campaigns, but campaigns have found ways of getting around that. I'm not saying you specifically, obviously, but there are ways that campaigns signal how they would like money to be spent. And with Citizens United, there's almost an unlimited ability for corporations to spend to support their own political causes. Is that a concern for you? Do you have any plans to address Citizens United? Do you have any plans to do campaign finance reform?
I don't think there's anything that's probably more important for our democracy than figuring out a way to reverse Citizens United from a pragmatic standpoint, because the Supreme Court has upheld that and has, I think, very, very wrongly equated campaign contributions with free speech and essentially given them First Amendment protections. I think that was a very bad decision. I think it's been a catastrophe for our country.